recording. So we discussed so far plants, in particular angiosperms, which are flowering plants, and it means that the seeds are covered, as opposed to gymnosperms, which means naked seed, which is the redwoods that we just looked at. There are gymnosperms. So the seed that you saw is a bract that came out of a cone. The one that looked like it was smaller than a penny. And it's weird to think of a seed that small growing to the size of 380 feet. So we'll talk about growth. It's very interesting how trees grow. There's a lot of plasticity in their growth patterns. And we discussed the two different kinds of angiosperms, the monocots and the dicots, or eudicots. So they have some differences. Monocots have one cotyledon, dicots have two, for example. There's differences in their root structures, their leaf vein structure, flower parts, and we looked at their differences with respect to roots and the structure and function of roots and how the roots have a large surface area. And we'll look at that again more closely when we look at nutrition and how roots take up nutrition. We also looked at, besides roots, stems. So I thought the redwood story was really good because of the growth of stems. And some of them are woody stems, and that's what we'll look at in a moment, growth. But we still need to look at the third organ. So there's roots, stems, and leaves, of course. So leaves have different tissue, epidermal tissue. And the epidermal tissue, which is the outer layer, that is underneath each leaf, interrupted by stomata. They're basically pores, and they allow carbon dioxide exchange between the air and the photosynthetic cells within the leaf. A ground tissue is in between the upper and lower epidermis of a leaf, and the vascular tissue is continuous with the vascular tissue of the stem. So this is what that looks like. So this is a great picture. I hope you can see it. Look at it a bit more closely here. So this is the epidermis here, the upper layer. The cuticle is the part of the epidermis that is waxy, and that protects the leaf from water loss. This is one of the pores here. Singular is stoma, I think, stoma. Plural is stomata. And each one of those has a guard cell. And the guard cells here, they open and close when appropriate. So if it's dry, they'll close to prevent water loss. This is the xylem and phloem here in veins. So these are the veins that run through the leaf. This is the upper epidermis, the lower epidermis. And the tissue that's in between is called palisade mesophyll and spongy mesophyll. So those are mostly parenchyma cells, the cells that function in photosynthesis and also in structure. So this is a micrograph showing here guard cells. And the air spaces, here are the guard cells and the stomata. So this is a transverse section. This top one is a surface view, so that's looking at a plane, but the bottom one is a transverse section. So it shows the palisade tissue, spongy mesophyll, the lower epidermis, and the upper epidermis. So that is the anatomy of a leaf. And the function, what is the function of leaves? What's the function of leaves? You can write that in the chat.
To gather sunlight?
Yes, to gather sunlight for photosynthesis, exactly right. So photosynthesis is the main function of leaves, and they're structured in such a way to optimize the gathering of sunlight for that purpose. Exactamundo. So there are two kinds of growth. There's primary growth, which we've looked at, and there's secondary growth, which adds girth. That's why the redwoods can be like 380 feet tall, because their girth is 30 feet. And that's secondary growth. It occurs in stems and roots of woody plants, but not in the leaves. The secondary plant body is tissues produced by two cambium layers. Cambium is tissue that adds new cells. The cork cambium adds to the bark, and the vascular cambium adds to the phloem and xylem. So the vascular cambium is a cylinder of meristematic cells. So they are basically embryonic cells. It's one cell thick. It develops from parenchyma cells. The vascular cambium. I know this looks like quite complex, but this is while a plant is growing, a woody plant in particular. So this is the layer of vascular cambium. It's just one cell. But what it lays down is, it lays down phloem and xylem. So phloem cells, which are the ones that will transport water from the roots, that will transport sugar from the leaves, and xylem cells that transport water from the roots. Most of the inside of a tree are old, non-functional xylem cells. That's secondary growth. So as the tree grows, more xylem cells are formed, but only these ones are functional. The other ones just become part of the structure of the tree. And the phloem starts to grow as well, but not as much. So phloem tends to be somewhat constant. And I wanted to talk about cork. So here is the cork cambium. Here, this layer. And it lays down periderm, which is just a small layer of cells, periderm, and cork. And together, that's known as bark, the periderm and the cork. So looking at a cross-section of a tree, so you would be counting the rings in this direction, or it doesn't really matter, I guess, in which direction you count them, but there is what is known as late wood and early wood when you're looking at rings. And the early wood is here. And you can tell it's early wood because the cells are quite large. In other words, the growth is quite fast. And that's what happens in spring and part of summer. Late wood, however, so this is, that's early wood. And late wood, the cells are a lot smaller. They don't grow as much, so that indicates that that period was winter. So there's always a light, it's just much larger than that, isn't it? There's a light part to the ring and a darker part to the ring because the cells are smaller. But this whole thing is 1 year's growth. Yeah, and here's the bark. There's the cork out here, and the cork cambium is running through there. This is the phloem. And this is all secondary xylem. So it's interesting how the cells grow. They have different ways of, after they divide, of arranging themselves. So in this case, here's your cambium. It's laying down a xylem cell here, a phloem cell there. The xylem cells move as more xylem cells are added. And it shows here 2 phloem cells, but the phloem doesn't get added to as much as the xylem. And as the tree or sometimes shrubs, woody shrubs age, the older layers of secondary xylem, that's known as heartwood, don't transport water and minerals. The outer layers, though, are known as sapwood, and they still transport materials through the xylem. So here is an example of growth rings. So this is the heartwood here, and the sapwood. The vascular cambium is this layer, and the secondary phloem is this layer. And the periderm and the bark is the outer layer. So the cork cambium lays down a periderm, which is a protective covering of cells. It's cork cambium plus the layers of cork cells it produces, and the bark is all the tissues that are external to the vascular cambium. So it actually includes the secondary phloem bark. All right, here's an exercise. Unscramble the words, and they are plural. Can you tell what they are?
Is the first one walnuts?
Yes.
Oh.
Walnuts.
Third one's acorns.
Acorns. Yeah.
Coconut.
Yeah.
Cranberries?
Yeah.
Hazelnuts are my favorite.
Oh, are they? They're nice tasting, aren't they? What about these?
Number 1. I don't know what the other one is though.
Blueberries?
Of course, blueberries.
Yeah, well done. What do they all have in common?
They'll have seeds.
They have seeds, yeah. So they all have seeds, and they all have fruit around the seeds. Different kinds of fruit, like coconuts have the white fruit. Acorns have they're a dry fruit. So are walnuts. Cranberries are a berry kind of fruit, of course, and blueberries. So different kinds of fruit.
I opened a coconut before, but I've only seen water inside and the flesh, or where I didn't see like the
Yeah,
the
so
tiny-
no, it's called the pericarp. Pericarp, I think that's the outside of the nut, or that might be the outside of the seed. I can't remember now, but the seed itself is inside, and the part that you eat, that is the nutrition for the embryo when it's going to start growing in the future. Yeah, so, for the coconut, for example, the hard white part of the coconut is called the endosperm. And it doesn't have anything to do with the sperm that has fertilized the plant. Rather, sperm is another word for seed. And it is the nutrition for a growing embryo. But enzymes break down the white, hard part of the coconut meat and make it into liquid. So when you're drinking coconut milk, that's what that is. And it's the milk. It's not really milk, of course, with the fluid that becomes available to the embryo. Yeah. And really, that's really where I wanted to end. The morphogenesis is very interesting. It's all about modeling how plants grow. We'll be using this plant called Arabidopsis. It's a fast plant. And so its genome sequence, we're not going to do DNA studies on them, but one thing that's very interesting about the growth of plants is that they increase the cell number, but also cell expansion. So the actual increase in plant size is usually due to cell expansion rather than cell division. So plant cells have the ability to elongate. And it's like muscle cells. Your muscle cells have the ability to grow in size. You don't get new muscle cells. Your muscle cells don't divide and you produce new ones. The ones that you have grow. So that's a kind of a similarity. Yeah, and the direction's pretty interesting too. Pretty important. So they're called planes of division of cells. Sometimes they're parallel like this. So they'll just divide and stay on the same plane. Sometimes they'll divide in 3 planes and they'll become a cube. So they'll grow in volume. And sometimes it's quite asymmetrical. So here's an unspecialized epidermal cell. It will divide, and the daughter cell, one of them, will become a guard cell. Then it will divide again and form another guard cell. And these are 2 guard cells. So yeah, growth is quite interesting. I'm not going to get into it more than that though, because I'd like you to do an exercise. So you can consider that this is where the lecture ended. And we won't look at the rest of that chapter. All right. Well then, thank you for watching. I can't forget that this is being recorded.